She arrived with mud on her boots, a dead mother's recipes in her bag, and absolutely nothing else. He was the most feared man in Colorado Territory, a cattle king who had crushed rivals, survived blizzards, and never once let anyone close enough to matter. Nobody expected a broke farm girl from a dried-up county to walk into his kitchen and ruin him completely, not with beauty, not with tricks, with bread, with pie, with the kind of quiet strength that makes powerful men suddenly question everything they built their lives around. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. You won't regret it. The wagon dropped her off at the wrong gate. She didn't know it was the wrong gate at the time. Clara Whitmore stood in the frozen dirt road with her travel bag hanging from one hand and a folded letter of introduction in the other, watching the wagon driver disappear around the bend without so much as a backward glance. The wind cut straight through her wool coat, a coat that had belonged to her mother and still smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried lavender if she pressed her face into the collar, which she did sometimes, late at night, when she thought no one was watching. She looked up at the iron gate in front of her. The letters had been forged directly into the iron. Not painted on, not nailed on. Forged, like someone wanted you to understand that the warning itself was permanent, that the man who owned this land didn't make idle threats. Clara had heard about Garrett Hale before she ever set foot in Summit County. Everybody had. In the cattle towns strung along the eastern slope of the Rockies, his name came up the way weather came up, as something you prepared for, not something you looked forward to. He had built Blackthorn Ranch from 40 acres of Rocky Mountain grassland into the largest cattle operation in the Colorado Territory. He had done it without a partner, without inherited money, and well, if the stories were accurate, without ever once asking anyone for help. The stories also said he'd had a wife once, that she died young, that he hadn't been the same since, though nobody seemed entirely sure what same meant when applied to a man like Garrett Hale. Because even before the loss, people described him as cold, exacting, and about as warm as a January river. Clara adjusted the strap of her travel bag on her shoulder and walked through the gate. She had been walking for nearly 20 minutes along the ranch road before she understood the scale of what she was looking at. The land rolled out in every direction like something from a painting. Pine-covered ridges rising in the west, open pasture stretching south, and everywhere the evidence of serious money carefully managed. Fence lines so straight and well-maintained they looked surveyed by a professional engineer. Outbuildings painted and in good repair. A bunkhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. Corrals holding cattle whose coats told you they'd been well fed through the season. She had grown up on a farm. She understood the difference between land that was loved and land that was merely worked. This land was neither, it was controlled. Every post, every gate, every drainage ditch had been placed exactly where it needed to be. There was no wasted space, no sentimentality, no overgrown corners where wildflowers were allowed to do what they pleased. It made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't immediately name. The main house appeared as she crested a small rise, and she stopped walking for just a moment. It wasn't a mansion. That was her first thought. She'd half expected something extravagant based on everything she'd heard, something that announced its own wealth loudly. But the house was large and solidly built without being showy about it. 2 stories of dark timber and stone, with a broad porch wrapping the front and west side. 4 chimneys. Thick shutters on every window. A house designed for mountain winters, not for impressing visitors. Though it would have impressed most visitors anyway. Clara started walking again. Look. The woman who answered the back door looked at her, the way you'd look at an unexpected package that had been left in the rain. "You're the girl from Dunmore County?" the woman said. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with gray-streaked hair pulled back severely enough to look painful. She wore a dark dress and a white apron so starched it could have stood up on its own. She looked Clara over from boots to collar without any attempt to disguise the assessment. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "Clara Whitmore. I have a letter. I know who you are. I wrote for someone with kitchen experience." The woman stepped back from the doorframe, but didn't exactly invite her inside, just cleared space and let gravity do the work. "I'm Mrs. Aldridge, head housekeeper. Come in. Don't track mud past the mat." Clara scraped her boots carefully and stepped into the kitchen. It hit her before anything else. The smell of it. Wood smoke and rendered fat and something sweet and yeasty that meant bread was rising somewhere nearby. The kitchen was enormous by the standards she'd grown up with, running the full width of the back of the house, with a cast iron range large enough to roast two whole animals at once, and a long oak work table down the center, scarred with years of chopping and kneading and the general violence of serious cooking. Two girls looked up from the work table, both young, both watching her with the flat, measuring look of people trying to determine if the newcomer was going to cause problems or just fade into the background. Dora, Ruth. Mrs. Aldridge gestured toward each of them in turn. They'll show you where things are later. Right now. She pulled the letter from Clara's hand, glanced at it, then set it on the corner of the table. How much kitchen experience do you actually have? Not what it says there, what you've actually done. My mother ran the house alone after my father got sick, Clara said. That was 6 years. I cooked for 3 harvest seasons for neighboring farms, up to 30 men at a time. I've done preserving, smoking, bread baking, and pastry. I can butcher a chicken, and I can make the cutting of it look like nothing was wasted. Mrs. Aldridge's expression didn't change, but something shifted slightly in her eyes. Can you follow a recipe precisely, or do you freelance? Both, depending on what's needed. Here, what's needed is precision. Mr. Hale expects his household run on a schedule. Meals at set times, no variation, no surprises. You'll assist Dora with breakfast preparation. You'll handle kitchen cleaning. And when we have guests, which is frequently, you'll work whatever hours are required without complaint. She paused. The pay is $9 a month, room and board included. The room you'll share with Dora. Any questions? Clara had about a dozen questions, but she could tell none of them would be well received right now. No, ma'am. Good. Mrs. Aldridge untied her own apron and rehung it on the wall hook with the precision of someone who hung aprons in exactly the same place every single time. The noon meal is in 2 hours. Wash your hands and help Dora with the potatoes. She didn't see Garrett Hale for 4 days. In those 4 days, she learned the geography of the house the way you learn any terrain, carefully, in pieces, watching for hazards. She learned that the dining room was strictly for Mr. Hale and any guests he entertained, and that the kitchen staff ate in the kitchen, always, without exception. She learned that Mrs. Aldridge's schedule was not exaggerated. Meals appeared at 7, noon, and 6:30, with the reliability of a railroad timetable. She learned that the 2 girls, Dora and Ruth, had been working at Blackthorn for 3 years each, and had constructed an entire private language of small gestures and expressions through which they communicated everything they couldn't say out loud. She learned about the ranch mainly from fragments, overheard conversations, things Dora mentioned while they were working side by side at the range. There's about 40 men working the ranch this time of year, Dora said on the second morning, not looking up from the pan she was tending. She was 17, younger than she looked, with a round face and the careful, economical movements of someone who'd been doing physical labor since childhood. Summer it goes up to 60, 70. They eat in the bunkhouse mostly. We send food over twice a day. Who manages them? Mr. Calloway. The foreman. He's fair mostly. Don't speak to him first. He'll come to you if he needs something. She slid the pan to the cooler end of the range. Mr. Hale manages everything else. All the contracts, the buying, the selling. He's up before anyone else and he works past dark most nights. A pause. He doesn't come in the kitchen usually. Does he eat? Dora glanced at her sideways. Mrs. Aldridge takes his meals to the study. Clara absorbed this without comment and went back to the bread dough she was working. It wasn't until the 4th day that she understood what "doesn't come in the kitchen" actually meant, that it wasn't a preference so much as a border. The kitchen was staff territory. The study was his. The dining room existed in the middle, and it was the only place where those 2 worlds were permitted to brush against each other, and even then only through the medium of a carefully arranged plate. She had been in this kind of house before. Not as large, not as wealthy, but the principle was the same. There were people who set the terms of a place, and people who lived inside those terms without ever being asked their opinion on them. Clara had been the second kind of person her entire life. She didn't think about it as an injustice. It was just how things were arranged, what she thought about. Working alone in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, while Dora and Ruth were still sleeping, was her mother's recipe book. She'd brought it in her travel bag wrapped in a piece of oilcloth to protect it from the weather. A small, battered notebook with a cracked cover where her mother had spent 30 years writing down receipts for everything she cooked, with little notes in the margins about what worked and what didn't, who liked a dish and who didn't, what to substitute when you were short on something. The handwriting changed over the years. tighter and more careful in the early pages when her mother was young, looser and faster toward the end when her hands had started to give her trouble. Clara had never shown it to anyone. It wasn't a secret exactly. It was just hers. The most personal thing she owned, now that her mother was gone and the farm was gone and everything else was gone. She kept it at the bottom of her bag and didn't take it out in front of the others. She met Garrett Hale on a Thursday, and the meeting was not what she had expected. She had a picture of him in her mind built from second-hand information, tall, severe, older than his years. The kind of man who filled a room with his authority even when he wasn't saying anything. She expected someone who looked wealthy, someone whose clothes announced his position, someone who would look through a kitchen servant the way you look through a window, aware of the glass but not really seeing it. She was carrying a tray of clean dishes from the scullery back toward the kitchen when she heard the back door open, and then she heard something she hadn't expected, which was the sound of someone very large and very tired moving through the door with the particular carefulness of a person trying not to fall down. She stopped in the hallway. Garrett Hale looked like he had been in a fight with the mountain, and the mountain had won several rounds. I was tall. She'd gotten that part right. But the height was obscured at the moment by the way he was moving, slightly hunched with one hand against the wall, his coat stiff with ice along the shoulders and front, his hat pulled down over a face that was red with cold and something that might have been pain. He was moving toward the kitchen, not the main house, which meant either he was confused or he simply needed to get warm faster than any other consideration. He hadn't seen her yet. Clara made a fast decision. She set the tray of dishes down on the nearest shelf and walked toward the kitchen. By the time Garrett reached the doorway, she was already at the range, putting a kettle on. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. His eyes were gray, a sharp, assessing gray, the color of sky before serious weather. He was perhaps 35, though the cold and the lines around his eyes made it difficult to be certain. His jaw was clenched, and there was a cut along his left cheekbone that wasn't serious but was bleeding in that slow, stubborn way cuts on faces tend to do. "Where's Mrs. Aldridge?" he said. His voice was flat. Not rude exactly, just economical, like a man who had decided long ago that he wasn't going to spend words he didn't need to spend. "She's at the main house, I think," Clara said. "I can get her—" "No." He came into the kitchen and put both hands flat on the work table, not leaning so much as stabilizing, the way you'd brace yourself if you weren't entirely sure the floor was going to behave. "I just need to sit for a minute, and something hot. Coffee's not made yet. I can have it in 10 minutes. "Fine." He pulled out one of the kitchen chairs, the plain wooden ones that lived along the wall for staff use, and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a very tired man. He didn't take his coat off. He dropped his hat on the table and ran one hand through his hair, and for a moment he just sat there with his eyes closed, which struck Clara as an unexpectedly vulnerable thing for a man of his reputation to do in front of a servant he didn't know. She turned back to the range and started the coffee. "You're new," he said after a moment. It wasn't accusatory, just an observation. "Yes, sir. I started Monday." "Clara Whitmore?" She glanced back. "Yes." Mrs. Aldridge mentioned she'd hired someone. He opened his eyes and looked at the work table in a general, unfocused way. "Where are you from?" "Dunmore County. My family farmed east of Ridgecrest, before the drought." Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy, exactly, but recognition. "How bad was it out there?" "Bad enough," she said. There was a version of that story she could tell in 2 sentences and a version she could tell in 2 hours. She chose neither. "The farm's gone now." He didn't offer condolences. She appreciated that. People offering condolences about the farm felt like people offering condolences about a body, technically appropriate and completely unhelpful. "There's more work here than Mrs. Aldridge can keep up with in winter," he said. This was, she realized, as close as he was likely to come to saying you'll be useful here. Not a welcome exactly, but something that functioned as one. "I'll carry my weight," she said. He looked at her then, directly, with the full attention of those gray eyes. And it was the kind of look that made her want to straighten up, not from intimidation, but from something else. Like being looked at by someone who was actually paying attention, which was its own kind of pressure. "I don't doubt it," he said. The coffee was ready 8 minutes later. She poured it, set the cup in front of him, and then, because she had been raised to finish a job she started, she found a clean cloth, wetted it, and set it on the table near his hand without comment. He looked at the cloth, then at her. For the cut? He said. Only if you want it. He picked up the cloth and pressed it against his cheek. He didn't thank her. He drank his coffee in silence while she went back to the morning's bread prep, and she stayed quiet too. And there was something in that shared quiet that felt less uncomfortable than it should have. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat from the table, and he paused in the doorway. You bake? He said. Yes, sir. He nodded once, something to himself, and walked out. That was the beginning. But beginnings aren't always obvious when you're in the middle of them. Clara went back to her bread dough, and she thought about her mother's recipe book at the bottom of her bag. And she thought about the farm back in Dunmore County, where the topsoil had cracked and blown away in 3 dry years, like something the land was simply shedding. She thought about standing in the empty kitchen of that farmhouse on the last morning, looking at the bare shelves where her mother's preserves used to line up in careful rows of amber and green and deep red, and feeling the particular loneliness of a place that used to be full of something. She didn't think about Garrett Hale specifically. She thought about his eyes, briefly. That particular shade of gray. The kind of gray that wasn't neutral, because nothing that alert was ever really neutral. And then she pushed the thought down somewhere practical and got back to work. The first week became 2 weeks, and 2 weeks became a month, and the rhythms of Blackthorn Ranch settled into her, like the rhythms of any place where you work hard with your body every day until the exhaustion becomes its own kind of routine. She was good at the work. She'd always been good at it, not brilliant in the way of someone with trained talent, but competent in the deep bedrock way of someone who had been doing it since she was 10 years old and had never been allowed to do it badly. Her biscuits rose cleanly. Her broth was clear and rich. She could judge the temperature of a range by feel and knew exactly when a roast was going to need to be pulled before the outside got ahead of the middle. Mrs. Aldridge noticed. She didn't say so directly. Clara was beginning to understand that direct acknowledgement wasn't something that came naturally to the housekeeper. But she started assigning Clara the more complex kitchen tasks and stopped supervising the results as closely. Dora noticed too, which was more useful because Dora actually said things. You cook like somebody taught you, Dora said one evening while they were washing up. Like somebody who cared about it. My mother cared about it, Clara said. She was elbow deep in the wash basin. She said cooking was the most honest thing a person could do because you can't fake it. Either the bread rose or it didn't. Dora laughed. A small, surprised laugh. I like that. She had a lot of theories. Clara rinsed a pot and set it on the drying rack. Some of them were more useful than others. Like what? Clara was quiet for a moment. She said that you can tell everything about a household by how it feeds people. Not what it feeds them. Anyone with money can buy good ingredients. The how. Whether it's rushed or careful. Whether the person cooking is thinking about the person eating or just thinking about getting through it. She hadn't meant to say that much. It had just come out. That sometimes happened when her hands were busy. Like the work freed something in her mouth that she normally kept more tightly closed. Dora was quiet for a bit. Then she said, what does this kitchen tell you? Clara looked around. At the range, the work table, the clean swept floor, the shelves lined with carefully labeled tins. It tells me someone cares about doing the job correctly, she said. But I'm not sure it's ever been about the people eating. Dora didn't respond to that, but she didn't disagree either. The gossip about Garrett Hale's situation reached the kitchen in pieces, the way gossip always does. Never a whole story, always fragments, always requiring you to assemble the picture yourself from pieces that didn't quite fit together cleanly. The railroad deal was the biggest piece. Clara heard it first from the stable hand who brought the morning milk. Something about a contract with the Meridian Pacific Line to supply cattle to construction crews working the western route. The numbers involved were large enough that she caught her breath slightly when she heard them mentioned. Enough to double the size of the ranch operation. Enough to set Garrett Hale up as the dominant supplier from Denver to the Utah border. And the catch, because there was always a catch, and the bigger the opportunity, the larger the catch, was that the Meridian Pacific had a preferred business arrangement with Franklin Beaumont, a Denver banker who controlled a significant portion of the capital that backed the railroad expansion. And Franklin Beaumont had a daughter named Evelyn, who was 24 years old and unmarried, and whose social situation would be considerably improved by a match with a successful territorial rancher. Nobody said it out loud in those exact terms, of course. What they said was that Mr. Hale was being courted for the Beaumont connection, that the arrangement would benefit all parties, that Evelyn Beaumont was a refined and accomplished young woman who would be an asset to any household. Clara heard all of this while cutting carrots or washing pots or rolling out pastry dough, and she filed it away in the same mental drawer where she kept all information that was relevant but not her business. She had been at Blackthorn 3 weeks when Evelyn Beaumont arrived for what was described as a brief social visit. She arrived with a private coach, 2 trunks, a personal maid, and an ease in her own skin that Clara recognized immediately as the ease of someone who had never once had to calculate whether they belonged somewhere. She was genuinely beautiful, dark hair, fine features, the posture of a woman who'd had someone reminding her about posture since childhood, and she moved through the ranch house like it was already hers, which Clara supposed was the point. Clara watched her arrive from the kitchen window and thought, she won't like this place in winter. She doesn't have the right kind of patience for it. It wasn't a charitable thought. She didn't dwell on it. What she did notice, over the 3 days of Evelyn Beaumont's visit, was that Garrett Hale's already limited warmth went somewhere else entirely when she was in the house. He was polite. He was attentive in the way of a man performing a social obligation he'd agreed to. He said the right things at the right times in the way of someone who had learned what was expected of him. He didn't look at Evelyn Beaumont the way he'd looked at Clara that first morning in the kitchen. That flat, direct attention, the gray eyes actually engaged. He looked at her the way you look at something you're trying to decide whether to buy. Clara noticed this and then put it firmly away because it was absolutely none of her business and she had bread to manage. The night that changed things, the first thing that changed things anyway, because there would be several, happened on a Friday in late November when a freak early snowstorm came down from the mountains and didn't stop for 2 days. The snow started in the afternoon, light and polite, and by evening it had turned into something serious. By 10 o'clock at night, it was the kind of storm that makes you aware of the difference between being inside and being outside in a very immediate way. Clara could hear the wind working at the shutters. The kitchen fire had been banked for the night, and she was the only one still up. She had a habit of finishing work late, partly because she was thorough, and partly because she slept badly. And the kitchen at night was warmer than the room she shared with Dora. She was kneading a batch of dough she was planning to set to rise overnight when she heard the back door. Garrett came in the same way he had the first time, cold and exhausted and moving with the careful stiffness of a man who had spent too many hours in the weather. But worse than the first time. He'd been out helping repair a section of fence the storm had already knocked down, apparently. And he'd been doing it in the dark with inadequate lantern light and in the kind of cold that gets into the joints of a person over 35 in ways that don't happen when you're 20. He stopped when he saw her and she saw something cross his face. Not irritation, more like a reflex toward privacy that he was overriding because the kitchen was warm and he needed to be warm. Didn't expect anyone to be up, he said. I work late sometimes, she said. Sit down. She did a quick inventory of what was available. There's leftover soup I can heat, and I started bread earlier. It should be ready to bake in an hour or so. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. She was already ladling soup into a pot and moving it to the range. Sit down. He sat. She had gotten better at reading his silences over 3 weeks of proximity. There was the silence of someone who wanted to be left alone, and there was the silence of someone who was too tired to generate conversation but didn't actually object to company. This was the second kind. So she kept doing what she was doing, warming the soup, wiping down the work table, eventually starting to portion the dough into loaves. And she let the silence do what it did without trying to fill it. When she set the soup in front of him, he looked at it for a moment and said, "What kind is it? Potato and leek. I made it this afternoon." He tasted it and didn't say anything, but he ate it steadily, with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely hungry and has stopped pretending otherwise. When he was halfway through the bowl, he said, "Where'd you learn to cook?" "My mother, mostly." "She was good at it?" "She was the best cook I ever knew." Clara shaped a loaf and set it in a tin. She said cooking was a language, that if you paid attention to what you were making, really paid attention, not just following steps, the food would tell you what it needed. She expected him to find this ridiculous. A lot of people did when she tried to explain it. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She's gone." 2 years ago, winter fever. "I'm sorry, so am I." She moved the loaf tin to the rack near the range. She died in the kitchen, actually. Not dramatically. She just sat down in her chair because she was tired, and she didn't get up again. I think she would have liked that. Dying in the place she worked best. She paused. That probably sounds strange. No, he said. It doesn't. She glanced at him. He was looking at the table, his hands wrapped around the bowl, and there was something in his expression that had nothing to do with the cold or the storm outside or any of the immediate physical facts of the moment. You built this ranch from the ground up, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Started at 22 with 40 acres and 14 cattle, he said. Borrowed money and worked until I didn't owe it anymore. Then worked some more. Sounds lonely. He looked up at her, the gray eyes. It was. Was. Past tense. Clara turned back to the range. She spent another hour in the kitchen, baking the bread while the storm threw itself at the shutters, and Garrett Hale sat at the kitchen table with his empty bowl and eventually a cup of coffee. And he didn't leave. He read some papers he'd pulled from his coat pocket, or pretended to read them, and she cooked, and the wind worked at the windows, and the kitchen was warm. When the first loaf came out of the oven, she cut it and put it on the table without asking, with butter and a small jar of the apple preserves she'd put up the previous week. She hadn't planned to serve preserves. She just knew the bread needed something, and the preserves were there and they were good and the moment called for it. He picked up a piece and ate it. She watched his face without meaning to. Just the way you watch a person's face when you've made something, and you're waiting to see what it does to them. Something happened. Something small and real. The set of his jaw changed. His shoulders dropped maybe half an inch. He blinked once, and when he opened his eyes again, there was a different quality to his expression. Not softer exactly, because she wasn't sure he did soft, but something less defended. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, almost to himself, "My mother used to make bread like this." Clara didn't say anything. She understood that some memories were not invitations to conversation. They were just things that surfaced and needed to be acknowledged and allowed to settle back down. They sat in the kitchen in the storm for another half hour, not talking much, and when he finally stood to go, he looked at her in that direct way and said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said. He left. The kitchen felt different after he was gone. Not emptier exactly, but aware of the absence of something that had just been there. Clara cleaned up the kitchen. She washed the bowl and the cup and the knife she'd used to cut the bread. She put the rest of the loaf under a cloth. She thought about the way his face had changed when he tasted it. She thought about her mother saying that food, done right, could reach places in a person that nothing else could get to. She wiped down the work table and went to bed. 3 days later, Mrs. Aldridge came to her in the kitchen in the middle of the morning with an expression that suggested she was about to say something she was not entirely comfortable saying. "Mr. Hale has asked me to pass something along," she said. She straightened the apron she was already wearing perfectly straight. "He says you made bread the other night." "Yes, ma'am. He asks if you would make it again." A pause, during which Mrs. Aldridge's expression suggested she found the entire situation mildly baffling. "And he asks if you have any other receipts you consider. His word, particular." Clara looked at her for a moment. Does he want to discuss it? Or he left it at that. Clara thought about her mother's recipe book at the bottom of her travel bag. She thought about the apple pie recipe on page 14, the one her mother had marked with a small star in the margin, which was her mother's way of noting something she considered especially good. The maple glaze, the cinnamon, the way the apples needed to be just underripe so they kept some tooth when baked. "Tell him yes," she said. "I have other receipts." Mrs. Aldridge gave her a look that contained a number of things she was clearly choosing not to say. "Very well," she said, and went back to whatever she had been doing before. Clara made the apple pie on the following Sunday afternoon. She made it the way her mother had taught her, which meant she made it slowly. She made the crust with lard and ice water and worked it as little as possible because her mother had always said that the more you worked pie crust, the tougher it got, and there was a lesson in that about leaving certain things alone. She peeled and sliced 6 apples by hand, not too thin, not too thick, and she added the maple syrup from the bottle she'd found in the back of the pantry, which was local mountain maple and smelled darker and more complex than the stuff you bought from Eastern suppliers. She was aware while she was making it that she was making it for him. Not as a task, not as a service, as a thing she wanted to make and wanted him to have. She noted this and did not examine it too closely. She sent the pie out with Mrs. Aldridge at the dinner hour. An hour later, Mrs. Aldridge came back into the kitchen. Her expression was still carefully neutral, but there was something slightly off about the neutrality. like a door that appears closed but has been left fractionally ajar. "Mr. Hale compliments the kitchen," she said. "Which means he liked the pie," Dora said from the range, without looking up. Mrs. Aldridge turned and looked at Dora with the expression of a woman who has been managing people's behavior for 30 years and is not going to start tolerating editorial commentary now. Dora studied the range with focused innocence. Clara dried her hands on her apron and went back to work. But she was smiling, just slightly. The kind of smile that happens before you can decide whether to let it. Outside, the mountain winter settled hard around Blackthorn Ranch, and the snow kept coming, and the wind worked the ridges, and somewhere on the other side of the ranch house wall, a man was sitting with a piece of maple apple pie, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, the house around him felt like something other than a monument to his own relentless effort. He didn't know what to do with that feeling, but he didn't push it away either. December came to Blackthorn Ranch the way it always did in the high country. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a door being kicked open. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days. The pastures turned white and stayed white. The cattle pressed together along the southern fence lines where the wind broke slightly, and the ranch hands moved in shorter shifts because the cold past a certain point stopped being uncomfortable and started being dangerous. Clara barely noticed the cold. She was too busy. The kitchen in December was a different place than the kitchen in November, fuller, louder, and operating at a pace that left no room for anything as luxurious as a slow morning. With winter settled in, the ranch hands needed hot meals more than ever, which meant the kitchen was running from 4:30 in the morning until 8 at night with barely a pause in between. Clara worked all of it. She got up earlier than Dora, stayed up later than Ruth, and somewhere in the middle of all that labor she found that she had stopped feeling like a newcomer and started feeling like someone who simply belonged here now, in this particular kitchen, doing this particular work. She hadn't been looking for that feeling. It showed up anyway. Garrett Hale showed up too. That was the thing nobody had prepared her for. It started small enough that she almost didn't notice it was happening. He came to the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual, to ask Mrs. Aldridge about the pantry inventory. Something about the sugar supply for the holiday week. Mrs. Aldridge was out, so he asked Clara, who knew the inventory because she'd done it herself 2 days prior. She told him what they had, what they were short on, and what she'd already put on the order list. He asked 2 follow-up questions about the flour, nodded once at her answers, and left. 3 days later he was back, this time asking about the schedule for the Christmas week meals, who was expected, how many, what was being planned. Again Mrs. Aldridge wasn't there, and again Clara answered him because she knew, and again he took the information and left without any unnecessary ceremony. The third time, he came in the afternoon when Clara was working alone, and Mrs. Aldridge was definitely available in the main house, and he asked her about what spices they had on hand for holiday baking. Clara looked at him. He looked back, apparently untroubled by the mildly obvious nature of what was happening. "Second shelf, left side of the spice cabinet," she said. "Cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, allspice, and ginger. The ginger's low. It should go on the order." "Right." He didn't move toward the spice cabinet. He leaned against the doorframe instead with his arms crossed, in the posture of someone with a few more minutes than he was letting on. "What are you making?" "Mince filling for pies." "How many pies are we talking about?" 12 for the Christmas table, plus however many extra if the bunkhouse order comes in." I was quiet for a moment, watching her work. She was used to being watched while she worked. Mrs. Aldridge did it as a quality control measure. Dora did it out of habit. Ruth did it because she was still learning. But being watched by him felt different in a way she couldn't cleanly define. Less like being assessed, more like being seen. "My mother made mince pies," he said, "but hers were different, smaller." "Individual ones? With the lattice?" "Yeah, I haven't thought about those in a long time." Clara added the clove to the filling pot and stirred. "I can do them that way if you'd prefer it. You don't have to go to the extra trouble." "It's not that much more trouble," she said. "Just a different mold." He looked at her again. "You do that?" "I'd do that," she said, like it was a simple thing, because it was. He was quiet again for a bit. Then, "Where'd you learn to make mince?" "My mother had a recipe. Her mother gave it to her, supposedly, though I have no way to verify that. The story might have gotten improved over time." That surprised a brief, real expression out of him, something that wasn't quite a smile but was clearly a close relative of one. Families improve stories. Constantly, she agreed. He pushed off the door frame. Thank you, he said, which had become the way he ended most of their exchanges. Brief and genuine, without the polished texture of a social nicety. Like a man who meant it and didn't know another way to say it. After he left, Clara stood at the range and stirred the filling and told herself firmly that she was not going to make anything out of a man asking questions about spices and mince pies. She was going to make mince pies, individual size with the lattice, and she was going to do it well because she did everything in the kitchen well, and that was where this particular story began and ended. The mince pies came out perfectly. She sent them to the dining room without drama. Dora found the empty pan the next morning and raised her eyebrows at Clara across the kitchen. Not a word, Clara said. Dora raised both hands in a gesture of pure innocence and went back to her work. The problem, if it was a problem, and Clara was still negotiating with herself about whether it was that it wasn't just the kitchen visits. It was the quality of his attention during them. Garrett Hale was not a man who wasted words, and he was not a man who stayed somewhere he didn't have a reason to be. She understood this about him now well enough to know that when he came to the kitchen and asked about spice inventory when Mrs. Aldridge was available 20 feet away, the spice inventory was not the point. She wasn't sure what the point was. She wasn't sure he was sure what the point was. But it was there, whatever it was, sitting in the kitchen with them like a third person. Neither of them was acknowledging. She did not write about it in any diary or speak of it to anyone. She carried it carefully, the way you carry something fragile in rough terrain, aware of it constantly, adjusting for it constantly, but not stopping to look at it directly, because stopping to look was how you dropped things. It was in this state of careful non-examination that she overheard the conversation that changed the temperature of everything. She had been sent to the main house pantry, the larger one, off the dining room hallway, where the better wine and the dry goods for guest meals were stored, to take an inventory of the Christmas supplies. It was a simple job, and she was doing it quietly with a pencil and a list when she heard voices in the dining room. The door was not fully closed. She recognized Garrett's voice and a second voice she didn't immediately place. An older man's voice, deliberate and carrying the slight roughness of someone who'd spent decades talking over noise. The situation is what it is, the second voice said. Franklin Beaumont has 2 seats on the Meridian Pacific Board. He's the reason the Western Supply contract exists as an opportunity at all. If you refuse the connection, I'm aware of the situation, Harlan. Garrett's voice was flat, in the specific way it got flat when he was controlling something. Then act like it. Evelyn Beaumont is a perfectly reasonable woman. She's not asking you to fall in love with her, she's asking, nobody's asking me anything directly, which is part of what makes this conversation tedious. Garrett, a pause. I've known you since you were 22 years old and couldn't afford boots that fit. I'm not going to blow smoke at you. The railroad contract saves the ranch from the next bad year. One bad year. And you know as well as I do. I know. Then the Beaumont match isn't a question of whether you want it. It's a question of whether you're willing to let sentiment or stubbornness, whatever it is, cost you everything you built. Silence. Clara had stopped moving. She stood completely still with her pencil and her list. I'll handle it, Garrett said finally. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now. A chair moved. Footsteps. Clara resumed writing on her list very quietly, her hand not quite steady. She finished the inventory, folded the list, and walked back to the kitchen with her face arranged in the particular expression she used when she needed nobody to ask her anything. The expression was not complicated. It was just the face of a woman doing her job, which she had been doing her entire life, which she was very good at. She stood at the kitchen range for a while without really doing anything. Dora came in from the scullery and stopped when she saw her. You all right? Fine, Clara said. I'm going to start the pastry for Thursday. Dora looked at her for a moment with the careful look of someone who knows better but also knows when not to push. Right, she said, and let it go. Clara made the pastry, and she made it well, and she did not think about what she'd heard in the hallway in any direct way. She thought about it the way you think about a storm coming down from the mountains, aware of it, tracking it at the edge of her attention, knowing it was going to arrive whether she prepared for it or not. That evening, after supper, she took her mother's recipe book out of her travel bag for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackthorn. She sat on the edge of the bed she shared with Dora. Dora was downstairs, still cleaning, and she opened it to page 1 and read through it slowly, not looking for any specific recipe, just reading the handwriting, the little notes in the margins, The practical commentary her mother had left like a series of small messages to whoever was going to cook from this book after she was gone. This one's better the second day. Make it ahead if you can. Don't rush the caramel. It knows when you're rushing it. Harlan's wife gave me this one. I improved it, but don't tell her that. Clara sat with the book in her lap and thought about her mother's kitchen. The low ceiling, the crooked stove, the window that let in the morning light at exactly the right angle in summer. She thought about her father before his back went, carrying wood in from the yard. She thought about the smell of the earth after rain in a good year, which was a smell that hadn't existed much in the last 3 years of their time on that land. She thought about what home was, and whether it was a place or whether it was something else, something you carried inside yourself through all the places you ended up. She closed the book and put it away. She told herself nothing had changed. She told herself this was a job and she was good at it, and she would do it well, and that was the only relevant fact. She was wrong on most of those counts, but she didn't know that yet. The shift happened on a Wednesday night, 12 days before Christmas, and it happened because of Garrett, and because of something he did that she hadn't expected from him. Mrs. Aldridge gathered the kitchen staff in the afternoon with the slightly formal manner she used when delivering news she considered significant. Mr. Hale has asked that the Christmas feast menu be handled differently this year, she said. Rather than the standard selections, he has requested a small pause, the kind that contained an editorial comment she was choosing to suppress. He has requested that Clara design the menu herself. The kitchen went quiet. Ruth looked up from her peas. Dora turned from the range with an expression that was working hard to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Mrs. Aldridge kept her eyes on the middle distance, slightly above all their heads, which was her way of delivering information while not engaging with the reaction to it. Clara will present the plan to me by Friday morning. I'll review it and pass it on. Any questions? Nobody had any questions, not out loud. After Mrs. Aldridge left, the silence in the kitchen had a particular texture. Clara kept working on the bread she had been working on before the announcement, and the quiet stretched for a beat longer than comfortable before Ruth said carefully, "That's quite a thing." "It's a menu," Clara said. "For the Christmas feast," Ruth said, "when the Beaumonts are going to be here." Clara didn't answer that. Dora turned fully around and leaned against the range with her arms crossed. "People are going to talk," she said. Not unkindly, just factually. "You know that." "People already talk," Clara said. "It doesn't change the bread." But she knew Dora was right. The ranch had its own social architecture, as rigid in its way as anything in the towns and cities. Who spoke to whom? Who ate where? What roles were fixed and what roles were negotiable? A kitchen servant designing the Christmas feast was not inside that architecture. It was a deliberate step outside it, and the person who had taken that step was not her. She thought about this conversation she'd overheard. The railroad contract. The Beaumont connection. The man who had said, "I'll handle it," and meant nothing definite by it. She thought about the way Garrett looked at her when they talked in the kitchen, and she thought about the way he looked at Evelyn Beaumont, and she put those two things side by side and looked at them until she was honest with herself about what she was seeing. Then she made herself stop. She designed the Christmas menu on Thursday evening, sitting alone in the kitchen after the others had gone to bed. She designed it from her mother's recipes and from what she knew of what was available in the Blackthorn pantry and root cellar, and she designed it the way her mother had taught her to design a meal. Not as a collection of individual dishes, but as a single thing with a beginning and a middle and an end, each part of it moving into the next. She presented it to Mrs. Aldridge on Friday morning. Mrs. Aldridge read it twice, said nothing, and took it away with her. That afternoon she came back and said, "He approves it. Start the preparations Monday." Clara nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Aldridge stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame, and Clara got the sense she was about to say something she had been holding for a while. "You are good at this work," she said finally. Not warmly. She didn't do warmth in that direct of a way. But plainly, with the weight of someone who chose their words carefully enough that plain felt like a lot. "I want you to understand that what you are good at and what people are going to make of this are two separate things. People will make it into something it isn't." "I know," Clara said. "I hope you know." She let go of the doorframe. "That's all." She wasn't wrong. The rumors started before the end of the week. Low and fast, the way rumors move through a closed community in winter when there isn't much else to talk about. Clara heard them in pieces the way she'd heard everything about this place. Fragments, glances, conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. The stable hand who brought the milk stopped making small talk with her. Two of the women from the laundry watched her cross the yard one morning with the particular intensity of people discussing something about the person they were watching. She told herself it didn't matter. She almost believed it. What she hadn't expected was Margaret Fenn. Margaret was the wife of Blackthorn's second-in-command foreman, a woman of perhaps 45 who lived in one of the staff cottages near the main gate, and who had, as far as Clara could tell, made it her personal mission to maintain the social order of the ranch with the dedication of a border collie keeping a herd in line. She came to the kitchen on a Saturday morning on the pretext of borrowing a particular size of baking tin, and after she got the tin, she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment that went on just long enough to feel intentional. "I hear you're running the Christmas table this year," she said. "I'm helping plan the menu," Clara said. Margaret turned the baking tin in her hands. "That's generous of Mr. Hale, giving a kitchen girl that kind of responsibility." The word kitchen girl came out measured, precise. Not shouted, not cruel in any obvious way, just placed exactly where it would do the most structural damage, the way you place a wedge at the right point in a piece of wood. Clara looked at her directly. "It is," she said. "I plan to do a good job." Margaret smiled. The smile meant nothing. "I'm sure you'll try, dear." She left with her tin. Clara stood alone in the kitchen and breathed steadily for a moment. Her hands wanted to shake, and she wouldn't let them. She was still standing there when she heard boots on the back step, and Garrett came through the door in his coat and hat with the cold still coming off him from the yard. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She almost said nothing. The word was right there. Automatic. The habitual nothing of a person who had spent a lifetime not placing her problems in front of people with more power than her. Instead, she said, "Margaret Fenn just reminded me that I'm a kitchen girl." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means she wants me to know my place." She turned back to the range. "She's not wrong, technically. She's wrong about everything that matters," Garrett said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, but the cousin of anger that belongs to a man who is accustomed to having his decisions respected and has just been informed they aren't being respected. "It doesn't matter," Clara said. "It matters to me." She turned around and looked at him. "Why?" He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hand, and for a moment he was just a tired man in a big house who had been building something for 15 years and had recently started noticing that the thing he'd built didn't feel the way he expected it to feel from the inside. "Because I asked you to plan this menu," he said. "And whatever I ask someone to do, they deserve to be able to do it without being made to feel small." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. "That's a reasonable position," she said finally. "It's the only position." She nodded once and turned back to the range, and he stood in the kitchen for another minute before he put his hat back on and left. And the kitchen was quiet again, and outside the December wind pushed hard at the walls of Blackthorn Ranch, and everything was the same as it had been an hour ago, except that it wasn't, not quite, not anymore, and both of them knew it. The Christmas feast happened on a Tuesday, with 12 people at the table including Franklin Beaumont, who was a heavy-set man with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never had to be uncertain about anything, and his daughter Evelyn, who was beautiful and composed and watched Clara move through the dining room doorway with the flat assessment of a woman who understood exactly what she was looking at. Clara served nothing herself. That was Ruth's role for the evening. She stayed in the kitchen and ran the timing, making sure each course came out at the right moment, managing the range and the oven, and the two girls with the quiet authority of someone who knew the territory well enough to guide others through it. The meal was good. She knew it was good. Not because it was complicated or showy, but because it was honest. Everything cooked correctly, nothing overreached, the flavors moving in the sequence she had planned, each thing in its right place. Garrett came to the kitchen doorway once during the meal, between the soup and the main course. He looked at her from across the kitchen. She raised her eyebrows in a question. "It's perfect," he said quietly, so only she could hear it. "It's not perfect," she said automatically. The carrots on the third plate were slightly overdone. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then, "It's perfect," he said again, and went back to his guests. She stood at the range and she let herself feel, just for a moment, the warm weight of that. Not the praise. She didn't need praise. She never had. What she felt was the specific and rare pleasure of having done something well for someone who noticed. Later, after the guest had retired and the kitchen was finally quiet and clean, after Dora and Ruth had gone to bed, and Mrs. Aldridge had done her final round of the house, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her mother's recipe book open in front of her. She had been at Blackthorn Ranch for 6 weeks. She had arrived carrying nothing but a worn bag and the smell of her mother's coat and the stubborn, bone-deep competence that was the only inheritance the farm had left her. She had been looked through and looked down on and called kitchen girl and reminded of her place by more than one person since she arrived. And she was still here, still in this kitchen, which she had come to know as well as she had ever known any room in her life, still doing the work, still doing it well. She closed the recipe book. From somewhere in the main house, she could hear the low sound of voices, Garrett's voice, and a woman's, and the distant clatter of something being set down on wood. She drank her tea. She didn't listen. She looked at the kitchen around her, the range holding its heat, the clean shelves, the small window above the sink where the mountain dark pressed up against the glass, and she thought about what Mrs. Aldridge had said. What you are good at, and what people are going to make of this are two separate things. True, Clara thought. Both things could be true at the same time. She had always known how to hold two true things at once. It was one of the skills the farm had given her. She put her cup in the sink, put out the lamp, and went to bed. Through the kitchen window, the December stars sat hard and brilliant over the mountain ridge, and Blackthorn Ranch held its cold, and somewhere in the house a decision was being circled like a fire that had been lit and couldn't be unlit, and nobody was ready to say so yet. The Beaumonts left on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon the ranch knew something had happened. Nobody said it directly. That wasn't how it worked at Blackthorn. But there was a quality to the air in the main house, a tightening, like weather pressure dropping before a storm, that Clara had learned to read over 2 months of living inside these walls. Mrs. Aldridge moved through the kitchen with the particular briskness she used when she was managing her own tension. The two housemaids who cleaned the upstairs rooms whispered briefly near the scullery door and stopped when they noticed Clara. She kept her head down and her hands moving and did not ask questions. What she heard came to her that evening through Dora, who had heard it from the stable hand who had helped load the Beaumont luggage, who had apparently been close enough to the main house entry to catch the last exchange between Garrett and Franklin Beaumont before the coach pulled away. The exchange had not been warm. Franklin Beaumont had shaken Garrett's hand with the mechanical politeness of a man who has been refused something he expected and has not decided yet what to do about it. Garrett had stood on the porch until the coach was through the gate and then gone directly to his study and shut the door. He turned her down, Dora said. She was saying it as a fact, not a judgment, keeping her voice low. They were alone in the kitchen, late, both of them too tired to do anything but sit at the work table with cups of cooling coffee. That's what they're saying. Clara stared at her cup. People are going to figure it out, Dora said. Not unkindly. Just the way she said most things. Plainly, because she was a practical girl who saw little use in softening facts that were going to land anyway. That he started coming to the kitchen after you got here. The Christmas menu. People have been watching. There's nothing to figure out, Clara said. Dora was quiet for a beat too long. There isn't, Clara said. Okay, Dora said, in the voice of a 17-year-old who is being diplomatic. Clara took her cup to the sink. Her reflection moved in the dark window above it. A woman with flour on her sleeve and her hair slipping out of its pin, who looked tired in the particular way of someone carrying something she was not acknowledging out loud. She poured out the coffee and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to Dora's breathing even out into sleep, and she thought about Garrett's face on the Christmas night when he'd stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "It's perfect," twice. And she thought about the conversation she'd overheard in November. The railroad contract saves the ranch from the next bad year. And she thought about what it meant that a man in his position, with everything he had built and everything he stood to lose, had made the decision he apparently just made. She thought about Margaret Fenn's voice. Kitchen girl. She thought about her mother, who had worked her whole life in a kitchen and died in one, and who had never once seemed to feel diminished by it, and who had told Clara that the difference between a servant and a person was not which room you worked in, but whether you understood your own worth. Clara understood her own worth. That had never been the question. The question was what happened when someone else's understanding of your worth was going to cost them something serious, and whether it was your responsibility to stop them from paying that cost, and whether you even could. She was still awake at midnight. She was still working on the question at 1. By 2, she gave up on sleep entirely, and got up and went to the kitchen and started a batch of bread she didn't particularly need to make, because that was what she did when she couldn't think straight. She put her hands in the dough and worked until something settled. The bread helped. It always did. There was something about the physical reality of it, the weight of it, the temperature, the way you could feel through your hands whether the gluten had developed enough, that pulled her out of her head and back into the world of actual things that could actually be done. By 4 in the morning, she had 2 loaves proving under cloths and she was herself again, which meant she had arrived at the same place she always arrived when she was honest with herself. She was a 22-year-old woman from a failed farm who was good at cooking and not very good at pretending she didn't notice things. She had no money, no land, no connections, and no particular claim on anything in this house except the bed she paid for with her labor. Whatever was happening in Garrett Hale's study or in his life or in the parts of his mind he didn't show to anyone. That was his territory, not hers. She told herself this clearly, and she meant it. The problem was that meaning something and feeling the weight of it lifting were not the same thing, and the weight did not lift. The new year came, and with it a shift in the weather of the ranch that had nothing to do with the actual weather. Garrett had refused Evelyn Beaumont, and the news had traveled. In a territory this size, in communities this tight, that kind of news didn't stay contained. By the second week of January, Clara was hearing it reflected back to her from the outside. The supply delivery man who came twice a month made a comment, careful and indirect, about the interesting decisions being made up at Blackthorn these days. 2 women from the nearest town who came to the ranch for a winter social with the foreman's family watched Clara serve the refreshments with the focused attention of people watching something they intended to discuss later. She served the refreshments. She went back to the kitchen. She did not look at anyone with the expression of a woman who understood what was happening, because that would have required her to admit that she understood what was happening. She was very good at not having the expression. What she was less good at, it turned out, was what happened on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-January when Garrett actually sought her out. He came to the kitchen in the late afternoon when Dora and Ruth were both elsewhere. Mrs. Aldridge had sent them on tasks to the other end of the property, which Clara understood in retrospect was probably not coincidental. He came in without any pretext this time, no questions about spices or schedules, and he stood on his side of the kitchen and she stood on hers, and the air between them had the slightly charged quality of a conversation that had been waiting to happen. "I need to talk to you," he said. "All right," she said. She was drying her hands on a cloth. She kept drying them even though they were already dry, because it gave her something to do with her hands. "You know what's been said around the ranch. I've heard things. I want you to hear it from me." He pulled out a chair from the wall and sat down, which surprised her slightly. It was such a deliberate, ordinary gesture, sitting down at a kitchen table, and it had the effect of making him look less like the cattle king of the territory, and more like a man who was tired. "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you'd rather have that than the other thing." "Yes," she said. "I've been coming here because I wanted to," he said. "Not for inventory or schedules, because I wanted to be here." He said it flatly, without decoration, like stating a fact about the ranch accounts. "I know what that looks like given my position and yours. I know what people are making of it, and I want to know what you make of it." Clara set down the cloth. She looked at him across the kitchen. This man who had built 40 acres into an empire and apparently just thrown a significant piece of the empire into uncertainty for reasons that were, at least in part, sitting in front of him in a flour-dusted apron. "I think you're being foolish," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. Something closer to respect, actually. The specific respect of a person who is used to being handled carefully and has just been declined. "Explain. You have an operation here that depends on capital connections. You turned down a match that would have secured those connections. The people who wanted you to make that match are now working against you." She had heard enough from the kitchen to understand the shape of it, even if not all the details. "And you're standing in my kitchen telling me you did it because you wanted to come here. To my kitchen." She paused. "That's not a small thing to have done for a kitchen servant, Mr. Hale. Stop calling me that." "Mr. Hale?" "The other one, kitchen servant." His voice had an edge, but not a cold edge, a frustrated one, which was different. "You know that's not how I see you." "I know," she said. "But it's how most of the rest of the world sees it, and the rest of the world is where your business lives." "I'm aware of that." "Then you understand why I'm saying you're being foolish." He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and ran both hands through his hair, a gesture she'd seen him make before, always when he was fighting with something he couldn't resolve by force of will. "I visited Harlan Wheeler last week," he said. Harlan was his old mentor. She'd heard the name before, The man who talked to him at the Christmas dinner. The man who taught me how to run cattle when I had no idea what I was doing. I went and sat in his kitchen, and I told him I needed advice. She went very still. He asked me what the situation was, Garrett said. I told him about the railroad deal, the Beaumont match, what I'd done. He looked at the table for a moment. He asked me why. I told him that there was a woman working in my kitchen who was the most honest person I'd met in 15 years, and that I was fairly certain I'd rather lose land and money and standing than... He stopped. Then what? She said, quietly. He looked up at her. Then not try. With you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved in the pines along the ridge. The fire in the range crackled once and settled. Clara stood in the kitchen with her heart doing something uncomfortable and inconvenient in her chest, and she thought about her mother's voice. The difference between a servant and a person is whether you understand your own worth. And she thought about everything that had gotten her to this room, this cold, this kitchen, this man looking at her from across a work table like she was something he had been trying to figure out for months. I'm not a simple thing to choose, she said. I need you to understand that. Not because of what I am, but because of what choosing me means for you. People won't forgive it easily. I know. The women in town already talk about the Beaumont people are going to make it worse. She was not delivering this as a warning so much as a list of facts she needed him to have. If we do this, it's going to be ugly before it's anything else. I know that too. And you're still sitting at my kitchen table. I'm still sitting at your kitchen table, he said. She breathed in, breathed out. I'm not going to make you any promises right now, she said. And I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what you just told me. But I need... She stopped, started again. I need time to think about what I want, not what you want, what I want. Whether I'm willing to be the center of the kind of story that gets told when a man like you chooses a woman like me. She held his gaze. Can you give me that? He was quiet for a moment, then, yes. All right, she said. He stood, and she expected him to leave, but he stopped with his hand on the back of the chair, and he said, For what it's worth. Harlan told me I was either being the bravest man he'd ever known or the biggest fool in Colorado Territory. He said he couldn't decide which. What did you say? I said probably both, he said, and left. Clara stood alone in the kitchen for a long time after that. Then she put the bread in the oven and went back to work. She was given approximately 4 days of thinking time before the world removed the question from the category of abstract and put it firmly into the category of immediate. The gossip that came back from town arrived on a Friday through Mrs. Aldridge, who delivered it in the kitchen after the morning meal with the particular quality of someone performing an unpleasant duty. There is talk, Mrs. Aldridge said without preamble. I want you to be prepared for it. What kind of talk? Clara said. The kind that comes when people are making 2 and 2 into 5. She straightened the corner of her apron. There are women in town saying you used the kitchen position deliberately, that you understood what you were doing when you made yourself visible to him. The word visible landed like a small stone, and that you've influenced his judgment in ways that are damaging to his interests. She paused. The Beaumont family has friends in town, and those friends are talking. Clara looked at the wall behind Mrs. Aldridge's head and breathed steadily. Do you believe that? She said. Mrs. Aldridge was quiet for long enough that it was its own kind of answer. What I believe, she said carefully, is that you are a young woman in a difficult position who has done nothing I have personally witnessed that was less than honest. Another pause. What I believe about intentions and outcomes, however, is not the relevant matter. The relevant matter is what is being said and what it is going to cost you to be here when it keeps being said. It was the most direct thing Mrs. Aldridge had ever said to her, which meant it was serious. Thank you, Clara said, for telling me yourself. Mrs. Aldridge nodded once and left. The town happened faster than Clara had been bracing for. She went in on the following Saturday with Dora to get supplies. It was her first time in Crestfall since arriving at the ranch, the nearest real town, 6 miles down the mountain road. She had not been prepared for the specific quality of the attention she received when she stepped out of the wagon. It wasn't dramatic. That was almost worse. It was quiet. The kind of quiet where conversations pause and heads turn, and then everyone returns to what they were doing, having made the assessment they needed to make. The woman at the dry goods counter was polite, entirely polite. The precise, brittle politeness of a woman who had been told something about you and was waiting to see if you were what she'd been told. Clara bought what was on the list. She thanked the woman. She walked out. On the boardwalk outside, a woman she didn't know, well-dressed, perhaps 40, with the easy authority of someone accustomed to social weight, was standing with two others, and as Clara passed, she didn't lower her voice nearly enough. "That's her," the woman said. Clara did not stop walking. She loaded the supplies into the wagon. She waited for Dora, who came out of the feed store looking like she had also heard something in there that she was now filing carefully away. They drove back up the mountain road without talking much. Halfway back, Dora said, without looking at her, "You all right?" "Fine," Clara said. "I've been called worse things than what she was implying, and by people who at least had the honesty to say it to my face." Dora was quiet. Then, "What are you going to do?" Clara watched the pine trees move past on either side of the road. She thought about the question she'd given herself time to answer, and she thought about what town had just shown her, and she thought about standing in a kitchen at midnight with her hands in bread dough, trying to work out the difference between what she wanted and what was sensible. "I'm going to go back to the kitchen," she said, "and I'm going to do my job, same as I have been." "That's it?" "That's it for now." Dora absorbed this. "And him?" Clara didn't answer for a moment. The wagon crested the last ridge and Blackthorn Ranch spread out below them. The main house, the outbuildings, the corrals, the smoke rising from 3 chimneys against the white winter sky. The scale of it was something she noticed differently now than she had that first day, standing at the gate with her travel bag. It looked less like a monument and more like a place. The kind of place that was still becoming what it was going to be. "He told me he'd rather lose all of this than not try," she said finally. "I need to figure out if I believe that. And if I believe it, I need to figure out what it means that I might feel the same way." Dora said nothing, which was exactly right. They came down the road into the ranch yard. A group of hands were moving cattle from one corral to another, breath steaming in the cold air, and somewhere across the yard Garrett was standing outside the barn in his coat talking to his foreman, and he looked up when the wagon came in. I didn't wave. She didn't either. They just saw each other across the frozen yard for a moment. Two people who both knew the conversation that was coming, and who were both not ready for it yet, and who both understood that not being ready was a temporary condition. Clara climbed down from the wagon and picked up her supply bags and walked toward the kitchen door. Behind her, the mountain sat white and enormous against the blue sky, and the wind came down off the ridge the way it always did in January, cold and indifferent to everything happening below it. She went inside. She put the supplies away. She started the afternoon bread. The hands that had been in those walls for weeks kept showing up, in the curl of dough under her palms, in the heat of the range, in the particular quality of the kitchen. In the late afternoon when the light came through the side window at a low angle and turned everything amber and warm. Those hands knew this kitchen now. They knew where everything was and how everything worked and which shelf the good spices were on and which burner on the range ran hot. She thought, "This is mine, not because I own it, because I've put myself into it." And then, quietly and without drama, "I'm not going to let anyone tell me I don't belong here." It was not a romantic thought. It was not about Garrett. It was about herself, the stubborn, intact, difficult to displace self that her mother had worked hard to build in her, and that drought and poverty and Margaret Fenn's small cruelties and a town full of careful, polite hostility had not managed to knock loose. She was still here. The bread was rising. The kitchen was warm. That, for today, was enough. February came in hard and didn't apologize for it. The cold that settled over the mountains in the second week of the month was the kind that stopped being a weather condition and became something closer to a physical opponent, something you had to actively fight every hour you spent outside, something that found the gaps in your coat and your boots and your planning and pushed through them with the patience of a thing that had all the time in the world. The ranch hands worked shorter rotations. The cattle losses started climbing. 3 of the smaller operations in the valley had already sent word that they were in serious trouble, which meant that by spring there would be ranches available for purchase at prices that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Garrett knew this. Clara knew he knew it because she watched the study light burning past midnight most nights, and because she could read the set of his shoulders when he came through the kitchen in the morning, the particular tension of a man running numbers in his head and not liking what they kept coming out to. The railroad contract had not recovered. When he'd declined the Beaumont connection, Franklin Beaumont had done what a man of his position and temperament would do. He'd made sure the doors that he could close got closed. The Meridian Pacific deal was gone. 3 secondary buyers who had been warm in December went cold in January without explanation. Garrett was not ruined. He was too careful and had built too solid a foundation for the damage to be immediately catastrophic. But the margin between stable and precarious had narrowed considerably, and in the cattle business in a hard winter, margins were everything. Clara heard most of this from the edges of conversations she was not a part of, the way she heard most things. What she understood, assembled from pieces, was that Garrett's best remaining option for the spring was a single large cattle shipment to a buyer in the Western Territories, a man named Aldous Crane, who ran a supply operation for the mining towns pushing through the mountain passes. The numbers were good enough to stabilize the ranch through the next year if the shipment came off. The problem was the route. She heard the route discussed one evening when the foreman, Calloway, was in the kitchen waiting for a message that Mrs. Aldridge was writing out. He was talking to one of the senior hands, not to Clara, and he had the tired voice of a man who had been having the same argument with the same facts for several days. Canyon Creek Pass is the fastest, but it's suicide in February, he was saying. The ice shelf above the North Trail has been dropping pieces since Christmas. One good freeze-thaw cycle, and the whole thing comes down. What about the Ridgeback route? 3 days longer. In this cold, that's 3 more days of feed, 3 more days of exposure. We lose 10% of the herd just from the crossing time. And the South Loop? Calloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The South Loop goes through Harker's Gulch. You want to take 300 head of cattle through Harker's Gulch in February with the Dolan outfit riding that territory right now? The hand was quiet. There's no good answer, Calloway said. There's just less bad ones. Clara kept her hands moving on the bread dough she was working and said nothing, and filed away what she'd heard. The Dolan outfit was another piece of information she'd accumulated. A crew of men, not quite outlaws in the formal wanted poster sense, but close enough that the distinction was technical, who had been operating in the southern reaches of the county since autumn, running cattle off smaller operations, and twice now hitting supply caravans on the mountain routes. 2 men from a smaller ranch had been badly hurt in the second incident. The territorial sheriff was aware. His awareness had not yet translated into much action. She thought about this canyon route. She thought about it late at night in the kitchen, the way she thought about most things that were bothering her, with her hands occupied and her mind free to work the problem from all angles. She knew those mountains, not from living on Blackthorn, but from growing up east of Ridgecrest, where the same range ran along the northern edge of everything. Her father had run supply himself, in better years, before his back went. She had ridden with him twice as a girl, 12, 13 years old, through the high country in winter. She knew the canyon country specifically because there was a route her father had used that most commercial drivers didn't know about, a secondary trail that ran through the lower canyon wall rather than along the shelf road that cut the exposure time by half and avoided the most dangerous ice formations. She had been telling herself this was not her problem. She had been telling herself that for 2 weeks, with the same results she always got when she tried to convince herself that a solvable problem was not her business. On a Thursday morning, she found Garrett alone in the study. She had never been in the study before. She knocked on the doorframe because the door was already open, and he looked up from his desk, paperwork spread wide, 2 ledger books open, the particular disarray of serious financial calculation. And something crossed his face when he saw her standing there that was both surprise and something else. Clara. He said it like he was reorienting himself. Come in. She came in. She stood in front of the desk because there was no good reason to sit down and she didn't want to be here longer than necessary. She had thought about how to say this for 3 days, and she had decided the only way was straight. I know a route through the lower canyon, she said, for the cattle crossing. There's a trail along the wall face. It stays below the ice shelf for most of the distance, and it comes out 2 miles east of where the standard road does. My father used it when I was a girl. It's narrow for a large herd, but it's manageable with the right lead riders. Garrett looked at her. The ledger books were open between them, and he didn't close them. How do you know it's still passable? He said. I don't. Not with certainty. But the geology doesn't change much. If the rock face was stable enough to hold the trail when I was 12, it's likely still stable. The ice shelf is above it, not on it. How wide? Wide enough for 2 animals abreast. You'd have to string them out, which takes longer on the trail itself, but you save a day and a half on the overall route, and you don't go anywhere near Harker's Gulch. I was quiet for a moment. He had that expression she'd come to know. not disbelieving, just running the numbers behind his eyes. How certain are you of the path? Certain enough to ride it myself before the crossing, she said. As a scout. She had not planned to say that last part. It came out of some place in her that was past planning. Garrett's expression changed. No. I know the terrain. I know what to look for. Your men don't. My men have been riding this range for years. They've been riding the standard routes, she said. The trail I'm talking about isn't on any maps I've seen. It's not a thing you find by experience with the standard routes. You find it by having been shown it. And if the trail isn't passable, if the rock face has shifted, then I come back and tell you it's not passable, and we work with the other options. And if you don't come back? The question sat in the room. I'm a careful person, she said. Clara. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger, something that was honestly closer to fear, which was more revealing than anger would have been. You're asking me to send you alone into the high canyon in February. I'm asking you to let me help, she said. The same way I helped with the kitchen supplies in December. The same way I've been helping with every problem that came through this kitchen since I got here. She held his gaze. I'm not made of different material than you. I just work in a different room. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll ride with you. You can't. You need to be here managing the preparation for the drive. If you disappear for 3 days to scout a mountain trail, your credibility with the hands drops at the worst possible moment. He knew she was right. She could see it in the way his jaw set. The specific set of a man who has just been handed a correct answer he doesn't want to accept. You take Lester Webb with you, he said. Webb was one of the senior hands, a quiet, capable man of about 50 who had been on the ranch for 8 years. He doesn't go out of earshot, and you take the rifle from the gun cabinet. All right. And you come back in 3 days, not 4. 3. 3 days, she said. She was almost out of the door when he said her name. She stopped. Clara. He was still at the desk. He hadn't stood, but the way he was looking at her across the room, and the ledger books and the distance of their respective positions was not the way a man looks at an employee. It was the look of someone who has something important to say and has not figured out the right words for it yet. Be careful. I will, she said, and meant it, and left. She and Lester Webb rode out on a Friday morning before sunrise. Webb was the right choice for this. He was not a talkative man, which suited her, and he had the steady, conservative judgment of someone who had survived long enough in hard country to understand the value of not doing anything stupid. He asked her 2 questions about the route on the first day, and after she answered them, he seemed satisfied with her competence, and they rode without much conversation, which was fine. The mountains in February at that altitude were not beautiful in any comfortable way. They were vast and indifferent and genuinely dangerous if you stopped paying attention, and Clara paid attention to every inch of it, the snow conditions, the rock faces, the wind patterns that told you where exposed ice would form. She felt the cold in her fingers and her face, and she didn't think about the kitchen or Blackthorn or anything other than the terrain in front of her, because in this kind of country, inattention was the thing that killed people, and she had no intention of dying on a scouting ride. She found the trail on the second day. It was smaller than she remembered. Childhood memory had a way of scaling things. And the entrance was partially blocked by a rockfall that looked recent, maybe the past year. She and Webb spent an hour moving stone in the cold until the path was clear, and then she rode it slowly with Webb behind her, reading the trail the way her father had taught her to read trail. Not just what was in front of you, but what was above you and beside you, and what the angle of the slope was telling you about what the next 100 feet were going to look like. The trail held. The ice shelf was 40 feet above them for most of the critical section, not on the path, which was what mattered. The rock face was solid. The footing was manageable. When they came out the eastern end, she stopped her horse and breathed the cold air, and felt something in her chest release that she hadn't known she'd been holding. Well, Webb said from behind her. Well, she agreed. It'll work, he said. He was not a man who wasted qualifications. If Lester Webb said it would work, it would work. They made it back to Blackthorn on the 3rd day before dark, which was when she had told Garrett she would be back, which mattered to her for reasons she didn't examine too carefully. She came into the yard cold and stiff and hungry, and aware that she probably looked like she had spent 3 days in the high country, which she had. Garrett was in the yard when they rode in. I was trying to look like he had simply happened to be in the yard, but he had been watching for them. She could tell by the way he moved toward them immediately, the way you move towards something you've been waiting for. The trail is passable, she said, before he could ask. Webb can confirm the details with Calloway. We'll need to clear the entrance fully before the drive. There's a partial rockfall, but the path itself is solid. Garrett looked at her for a moment. He had snow on his coat from whatever he'd been doing earlier, and there was something in his expression that was several things at once. Relief and something else. Something rawer. You're all right, he said. Not a question. Cold and hungry, she said. But yes. He held the bridle of her horse while she dismounted, which was not a thing an employer did for a kitchen servant, and it was noted by the two hands crossing the yard nearby, and Clara noted that they noted it, and she didn't look away from any of it. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Thank me when the herd gets through. She handed him the reins and walked toward the kitchen. The crossing was set for the last week of February, and in the 2 weeks between the scouting ride and the departure date, something changed in the atmosphere of the ranch. She felt it before she understood it, a subtle realignment in the way certain people looked at her and moved around her. The hands who had been carefully neutral since the Christmas dinner gossip started doing something different. Not warmth, exactly. These were working men who didn't trade in warmth with people they didn't know well, but a kind of acknowledgement, a nod across the yard, a respectful step aside when she was carrying something. Word of the scouting ride had moved through the bunkhouse. Calloway stopped her in the yard one morning and said, without preamble, "Webb says you ride well." "My father taught me," she said. "And you found this trail from memory? From when you were a girl?" "From when I was 12. My father believed in teaching things properly." Calloway was quiet for a moment, with the look of a man reassessing. "The crossing route you found cuts the Harker's Gulch risk entirely?" "Entirely. You'll be through the canyon before you're anywhere close to that territory." He nodded once. He started to walk away, and then he stopped. "Mr. Hale said you volunteered to ride the Scout, that you came to him with the route." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with something that might, in a more expressive man, have been called respect. He said, which from Calloway apparently constituted a significant endorsement, and walked away. The night before the drive was to depart, Clara could not sleep. This was not unusual for her, but the quality of the sleeplessness was different. Not anxious, more like the feeling before a storm you have correctly predicted and have done everything you can to prepare for, and now simply have to wait out. She got up at 3 and went to the kitchen and found Garrett already there. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, which meant he'd been up for a while, and he looked up when she came in without the surprise that would mean he hadn't been partly expecting her. "Couldn't sleep either," she said. "No." He had the maps spread on the table, the survey maps of the territory with the canyon route she'd described drawn in pencil in his own handwriting. He'd been over them so many times the paper was starting to soften at the fold lines. Clara put a pot on his range and sat down across from him. The kitchen was cold because the fire had been banked low for the night, and she pulled her shawl tighter. "It's going to work," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I know the trail is good, and I know your men are competent, and I know you've planned this the way you plan everything, which is carefully and without kidding yourself about the hard parts." She looked at him across the maps. "That's all you can do. The rest is weather and luck." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And in the quiet of the kitchen at 3 in the morning, something that had been circling between them for months simply settled. "I meant what I said," he said. "In January. In the kitchen." "I know you did. And I meant it more after you came back from that scouting ride," he said. "I want you to know that. I was sitting in this kitchen for 2 days trying not to think about the canyon, and when you rode in—" He stopped, started differently. "There are things I know how to say and things I don't. This is one of the second kind." "I know," she said, "but I'm saying it anyway." "I know that too," she said softly. She poured the coffee when it was ready, and they sat together in the early dark of the kitchen with the maps between them and the ranch around them sleeping, and they didn't talk much after that because there wasn't much left that needed saying. And when the first gray light started at the window, Clara looked at him across the table and thought about her mother's voice and the recipe book, and the long road from a dried-out farm in Dunmore County to this kitchen in these mountains. And she thought, "I'm still here, and I'm here on my own terms," which was the thing that mattered. Not who she was to him or what people were going to say about it, but the fact that she had arrived at this moment standing up, carrying her own weight, having earned the ground under her feet. The drive departed before sunrise. Clara stood in the yard in the cold and watched the cattle move out of the corrals. 312 head, a long, dark river of animals moving through the lantern light, and watched the hands fall into their positions, and watched Garrett ride to the front of the column on his bay horse and pause and look back. He found her in the yard, even in the dark, across the distance. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and rode out. Clara stood in the yard and watched until the last lantern light disappeared around the ridge, and then she went back inside. She had work to do. The drive was gone for 9 days. 9 days was within the expected range. Calloway had estimated 8 to 11 depending on conditions, and Clara had done the math herself enough times that she knew every possible variation of the timeline by heart. 8 days meant everything had gone smoothly. 11 days meant problems that had been managed. Anything past 11 meant something had gone wrong in a way that couldn't be managed quietly. She told herself this every morning. She got up before dawn, she started the kitchen, she worked through the day the way she always worked, thoroughly, without wasted motion, finishing one thing before starting the next. The kitchen did not suffer for her distraction because she did not allow herself to be distracted. That was the discipline her mother had built into her, the same discipline that had kept the farmhouse running through 3 years of drought and her father's illness and all the other slow disasters that had eventually taken everything anyway. You keep your hands moving, you keep the fire going, you don't spend energy on the things you cannot reach. The ranch was quieter without the hands, smaller in some way that had nothing to do with its actual size. Mrs. Aldridge ran the diminished household with the same exacting rhythm she always maintained, and Dora and Ruth worked beside Clara with the subdued quality of people in a waiting room, technically occupied but fundamentally elsewhere. On the 5th day, Dora said, "Do you think they're through the canyon by now?" "Should be," Clara said. She was skimming stock for the evening broth. "If the trail held the way I expect, they cleared it on day 3. And the weather's been stable. So far." Dora was quiet for a bit. Then, "He'll be all right." Clara kept her eyes on the pot. "I know. I'm just saying." "I know, Dora." What she didn't say, because saying it would have made it larger than she wanted it to be right now, was that she had stopped sleeping fully on the 4th night. Not dramatically. She still went to bed, still closed her eyes, still got a few hours of the kind of shallow rest that keeps a body functional. But the deep sleep, the kind that came from a settled mind, had packed up and left somewhere around midnight on day 4 and hadn't come back. She thought about this canyon in the dark. She thought about ice and rock and 300 cattle and 40 men and one particular man on a bay horse who had looked back at her from the head of the column before riding into the dark. She thought about the ice shelf she'd seen from below on the scouting ride, the way it sat above the trail, enormous and ancient and genuinely indifferent to everything happening beneath it. She got up on those nights and went to the kitchen and worked until she was tired enough to sleep, and she did not examine the fact that she was doing this too closely, because she already knew what it meant, and knowing it clearly at 3 in the morning was not going to improve anything. On the 8th day, she took her mother's recipe book out and sat with it at the kitchen table in the evening, not reading it specifically, just holding it the way you hold something that connects you to a time when things were both harder and simpler. Her mother had been afraid plenty of times. Clara knew this not from anything her mother had said directly, but from reading between the lines of the recipe book, from the practical, grounding quality of the notes her mother had left. Make the bread when you're worried. Your hands know what to do even when your head doesn't. Clara made bread on the 8th night. She made it slowly and well, the way her mother had taught her, and it helped the same way it always helped. Not by solving anything, but by reminding her that she had survived every previous version of not knowing, and that the particular not knowing of right now was not different in kind from any of the others, only in scale. They came back on the 9th day. She heard them before she saw them. The distant sound of cattle coming down the mountain road, the shouts of hands working the herd, the particular noise of a large operation in motion. She was in the yard already, having stepped out for water, and she stopped with the bucket in her hand and listened to the sound get closer. The first cattle came around the ridge still moving well, which was the first good sign. Tired animals from a hard crossing moved differently, and these were moving like animals that had been handled competently. The hands behind them were cold and looked it, faces raw from days of mountain wind, but they were upright in their saddles and nobody had the emergency quality of a crew that had taken serious losses. She was counting, without really deciding to count, watching the animals come through the gate. She didn't see Garrett in the first part of the column. She didn't see him in the middle section either, and that was when something cold that had nothing to do with the February air moved through her chest. She kept her face still. She kept watching. Calloway came through the gate on his horse looking like he'd aged 3 years and 9 days, and she caught his eye. He read her face immediately. "He's at the back," he said, before she could ask. "He's riding. He's all right," she breathed. "Had a situation at the canyon exit," Calloway said. He had stopped his horse beside her. His voice had the flat quality of someone delivering a report they've already composed in their head for this exact moment. "Ice shelf dropped a section on the second day out. We were clear of it, mostly. The trail you found kept us below the worst of it. But the rear section of the herd spooked and pushed into the creek crossing, and Garrett went in after 2 of the hands who went down with them." She looked at him. "River was half frozen," he said. "He got them both out. Webb and another man pulled Garrett out after. He was in the water maybe 4 minutes." He paused. "He's been cold since. Riding, but cold. We kept moving because stopping wasn't safe. 4 minutes in a half-frozen river in February." "How cold?" she said. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. "Not frostbite cold. He's been coherent the whole time, but he needs warmth and he needs rest and—" Calloway stopped and looked at her directly for a moment with the expression of a man who is deciding how much to say. "He asked about you, when he came out of the water and was coherent enough to ask. First thing he said." Clara set the bucket down. "Garrett came through the gate last, behind the final cattle and the rear hands, riding the bay horse that looked as exhausted as everything else. He was upright. She had been told he was upright, but she needed to see it. And his coat was stiff in a way that told the story Calloway had told her, and his face was the particular weathered blank of a man operating on reserves rather than actual energy. He saw her standing in the yard. He pulled the horse up and just looked at her for a moment, and she looked back, and the yard was full of noise and movement, and none of it was relevant. "You look terrible," she said. Something in his face shifted, that almost smile, the same one she'd first seen months ago over mince pie recipes. "Feel worse," he said. His voice was rough. "Come inside." She didn't ask. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, and she heard him dismount behind her, and she heard him follow her, and she went to the range and had it burning higher within 2 minutes, and she had the kettle on before he made it through the door, and lowered himself into the kitchen chair with the careful, measured movement of someone whose body is reporting several complaints at once. She brought him hot water with a piece of the dried ginger she kept for medicinal use and honey from the shelf, and he held the cup in both hands and let the warmth into them without arguing about it, which told her how tired he actually was. She sat down across from him. She looked at him. He looked at her. "The crossing worked," he said. "Your trail. We lost 4 head total, 2 in the creek incident, 2 from the cold on day 7. 308 delivered." He paused. "Crane took all of them. Paid on delivery." She let out a slow breath. "The ranch is stable," he said. "Through the year at least. Maybe 2 years if the spring market holds." "That's enough," she said. "Yeah." He looked at his cup. "It is." They were quiet for a moment. Outside she could hear the yard settling, animals being dealt with, men heading for the bunkhouse. The ordinary noise of a working operation coming back to rest. "Calloway told me about the river," she said. "He would." 4 minutes. It wasn't 4 minutes. He said 4 minutes. Calloway exaggerates. He looked up at her. "I'm here." "I know you're here," she said. "I can see you're here." She kept her voice even. "I'm just noting that 4 minutes in a February river is not... It's not a small thing, Garrett." It was the first time she had used his given name. It came out simply, without drama, the way things come out when you've been holding them carefully for long enough that careful stops being the right approach. He went still for a moment. "No," he said quietly. "It's not a small thing." She looked at him across the table. This difficult, private, stubborn man who had built something remarkable and nearly lost it and gotten it back and almost drowned in a half-frozen river, and was sitting in her kitchen at the end of it, looking at her like she was the thing that had kept him oriented through all of it. And she thought about her mother's voice, one more time, one of the last things she'd said to her before the fever took her. "Clara, the only real mistake is choosing something small when something large was available to you. Don't be afraid of the large things." "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said. It was not a response to anything he had specifically said. It was a response to everything, to to the conversation in January and the scouting ride and the 9 days in the kitchen making bread she didn't need, and the moment in the yard when she hadn't seen him in the column and something in her had understood, with terrible clarity, what his absence would actually feel like. He set down the cup. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a romantic gesture, not a careful gesture, just a direct one. The hand of a man who had spent 9 days in the mountains and 4 minutes in a frozen river and wanted, in the most uncomplicated possible way, to touch the person he'd been thinking about through all of it. "I know," he said. They sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The spring came the way spring comes to the high country, slowly, skeptically, as if it wasn't entirely convinced winter was finished yet. The snow pulled back from the lower pastures in March and the upper meadows in April, and the ranch moved out of its winter-contracted state and expanded again into the fuller version of itself. More men, more animals, more noise and work, and the particular energy of a cattle operation hitting its working season. The news that Garrett Hale was courting his kitchen servant spread through Summit County. The way news spreads through a small territory, fast, thorough, and with significant editorial embellishment. Clara heard versions of their own story that bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened, which she supposed was the price of being interesting to other people. The talk was not kind, at first. The women who had watched her in Crestfall that January were now watching her with the heightened attention of people whose suspicions have been confirmed. There were still the careful pauses when she entered a room, the conversations that rerouted when she approached. Margaret Fenn said something at a spring social that Clara heard secondhand, and which was pointed enough that Dora reported it to her with genuine anger on her behalf. "What did you say?" Dora asked, watching her face. "Nothing yet," Clara said. "You're not angry?" "I'm angry," she said. "I'm just not surprised. And being angry at someone for being exactly who they showed you they were from the beginning is a waste of energy." What changed was not the town's opinion, at least not immediately. What changed was the ranch. It changed because of the crossing, and because of what the hands who had been on that drive brought back with them. Not just cattle and payment, but a story, the kind of story that travels because it earns its way. The story of the trail that the kitchen girl had remembered from her childhood. The story of the route that avoided the Dolan territory and the worst of the ice shelf and brought 300 head through alive. The story of Callaway coming back and telling anyone who would listen that without Clara Whitmore's scouting ride, they would have taken the Canyon Shelf Road and probably buried men and cattle under that February icefall. Stories like that do not stay contained to the bunkhouse. By April, when Clara walked through the yard, the nods she received had changed in quality. Not deferential. These were working men, not a court, but genuine. The kind of acknowledgement you give someone who has demonstrated they are worth the space they take up. Webb stopped her one morning near the corral. He was a man who used words economically and always had, and what he said was, "Your father taught you well." That was all. But from Lester Webb it was a complete sentence. Mrs. Aldridge's change was the most unexpected. It came on a Tuesday in late April when Clara was doing the kitchen inventory. The same job she'd done 100 times by now, so familiar she could do it in her sleep. And Mrs. Aldridge came and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. "I owe you something," Mrs. Aldridge said. Clara looked up. "When you arrived, I thought you were temporary," she said. The word temporary came out with the specific weight of someone who has been wrong about something and knows it and is being honest about it anyway. "I managed you as something that would pass through. I should have managed you as someone who was staying." She paused. "That was my error." "You were doing your job," Clara said. "I was doing my job without seeing clearly." She straightened the corner of the doorframe with one finger, the small habitual gesture. "I see clearly now." It wasn't an apology. Mrs. Aldridge was not built for apologies. But it was the thing that functioned as one, from someone whose function equivalence had to be enough. And Clara received it as such. "Thank you," she said. "That means something to me." Mrs. Aldridge nodded once and went back to her work. Garrett proposed on a Thursday in May, which was not a romantic day of the week, but it was the day it happened, and Clara thought later that it was probably appropriate that he did it in the kitchen rather than anywhere more staged, because the kitchen was where everything real between them had actually occurred. He came in after the morning work, still in his work clothes, and he sat at the kitchen table, the same chair he'd been sitting in since November. And he looked at her with those gray eyes that she knew now in all their variations, and he said, "I want to marry you." I think you already know that, but I want to say it plainly so there's no room for any other interpretation. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. There are still people who are going to make noise about it, he said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The Beaumont crowd isn't going away. Some of the county families are going to be difficult for a while. I know that. And I want you to know that I don't care. Not as a romantic gesture. I care as a practical fact. I have considered what they can do and what it costs, and I'm telling you plainly, I don't care. She looked at him. The man who had ridden into her kitchen in November covered in ice and exhaustion, who had come back to it over and over for reasons neither of them was ready to name, who had gone into a frozen river for his men and come out the other side still asking about her. You're still the most difficult person I've met in years, she said. I know. You're private to the point of being a problem sometimes. Also true. And you have no talent whatsoever for saying things simply the first time. I'm saying this simply, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. She breathed. She thought about her mother. She thought about the farm that was gone and the road that had brought her here, and the kitchen that had become hers in every way that mattered. She thought about the large things her mother had told her not to be afraid of. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. He stood up and crossed the kitchen, and the gap between them closed, and when he put his arms around her, she felt very plainly the specific weight of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has finally found somewhere to put it down. They were married in June, on a Saturday, outside the ranch house in the meadow that had come green and full with the spring. Not a large ceremony. Neither of them wanted a large ceremony, and there had been enough performance already in the past months to last both of them a while. What they wanted was the people who had been there for the actual story, and that was who came. The hands were there. Calloway stood in the front row in a clean shirt that looked like it had been borrowed and ironed by someone who cared about the occasion more than he did. Webb was there, standing beside Dora, who had cried already, and was managing the evidence of this with limited success. Mrs. Aldridge stood near the back in her best dress, and her face was as composed as always, except for something in her eyes that Clara caught once and didn't mention. Harlan Wheeler was there, the old mentor, the man Garrett had ridden to see in December to ask about courting a kitchen girl. He found Clara before the ceremony and shook her hand in the manner of someone evaluating a business proposition, which she found she didn't mind. He told me about you, he said, in December. He told me, she said. I told him he was either very brave or very foolish. He studied her for a moment. I've revised my opinion. Which direction? She asked. Both still apply, he said, but the proportions have changed. He let go of her hand and went to find his seat. The ceremony was short, and the afternoon was long and warm, and by evening there were lanterns hung in the yard, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought whiskey of questionable provenance, and the ranch that had been cold and contracted all winter opened up into something looser and warmer and genuinely alive. Clara stood at the edge of the lantern light later that night, with a cup of something warm in her hands, watching the yard. She watched Webb and Dora argue good-naturedly about something. She watched Calloway talk to Harlan Wheeler with the expression of a man who has strong opinions about cattle operations, and has found someone willing to hear them. She watched her husband move through his own yard, the yard he had built, the place he had made from nothing, and she watched the quality of how he moved through it, which was different than it had been in November, different even than it had been in March. He moved like someone who was in the right place. She understood that because she felt the same way, standing here in the lantern light at the edge of her own life, which was the life she'd arrived at with nothing but a worn bag and her mother's recipes, and the stubborn, bone-deep sense that she was worth more than the size of the room she'd been given. She had been worth more. And here was the proof of it. Not the marriage, not the ceremony, not any of the external things, but the fact that she had made something real in this place. She had worked her way into it honestly, without pretense, without diminishing herself to fit into the space she'd been assigned. She had been a kitchen servant, and she was still, in many ways, a woman who knew kitchens better than drawing rooms, and probably always would. That had not changed. The flour still got under her fingernails. Her hands still knew the weight of bread dough and the temperature of a range by feel. None of that had changed. What had changed was what it meant. Or rather, what had changed was that she had stopped letting other people's interpretation of it be the one that mattered. Garrett found her at the edge of the light. He stood beside her and looked out at the yard the same way she was looking at it. Two people watching the same thing from the same place, which was its own kind of definition of something. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "My mother," she said. She would have found all of this extremely satisfying. The party, the whole thing, the unlikely outcome of it. She looked at him. She had opinions about unlikely outcomes. She was in favor of them. He was quiet for a moment. So am I, he said. As it turns out, the fiddle started up again somewhere in the yard, and someone laughed, and the lanterns moved in the warm night air, and Blackthorn Ranch lay spread around them in the dark. The house, and the corrals, and the pastures, and the mountain ridge against the stars. All of it built by a man who had started with 40 acres and a debt he worked 14 years to clear, all of it still standing because of a winter that should have broken it and didn't. Not because the winter wasn't hard. It was hard. It was hard the way things are genuinely hard, when the margin between surviving and not is real and not dramatic. What got it through was not luck and not grace and not any clean or comfortable thing. It was a woman who remembered a trail, a man who understood what he was choosing, two people who decided that the cost of the honest thing was worth paying. Empires, Clara thought, are built with cattle and contracts and early mornings and the kind of ruthless patience that most people cannot sustain. She knew this because she had watched one get built from the kitchen. But a home, a real one, the kind that is warm from the inside out, that was a different project entirely. That was built from the small things, the recurring things, the bread that came out right, and the coffee in the dark, and the willingness to be in the same room with another person without performing anything. The willingness to be known by someone, which was the thing most people spent their whole lives avoiding because it was the most frightening thing there was. Clara Whitmore Hale stood in the lantern light outside the house that was now hers and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily trace back, the particular fullness of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. The ranch still had problems that would need solving, and the county still had people who were going to be difficult, and she and Garrett were both too private and too stubborn, and were going to argue about things that mattered, and probably about some things that didn't. But the bread was good, the kitchen was warm, and neither of them was alone anymore. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took a hard winter to prove it.